All right, so we're back and we're going to talk about slope or gradient. So how steep. So in a waterfall, right, you have like really steep, or in a very shallow kind of sandy river down by the beach, it might be very shallow gradient. So stream slope can determine things like velocity and the erosive capacity of streams. And I'm just going to talk to you about how do we measure this. One of the simplest ways, and you'll get to do this in the field, is you take a long piece of wood and you find just a level, carpenter's level. And this blue line is the water. So you take the rod, the piece of wood, and you put it right at the surface of the water. This box is off a little bit, but right at the surface of the water. And then you, going downstream, you hold it level. The downstream end will likely be well above the water, okay, unless you're in a completely flat part of the stream, which is pretty unlikely. So if you know the length of your rod, and then you measure the height of the rod above the surface of the water at the downstream end, okay, that's this here, this Y, the height of the rod above the water, then you can use trigonometry to solve for the angle of the stream. And so this is a right angle here, right? If you're holding it perfectly level and you drop your ruler straight down, you've created a right triangle. So we can use the laws of trigonometry to help us figure out what this angle is. And so if you haven't thought of trigonometry for a while, we're just going to learn about the anatomy of a right triangle. So again, you have a right angle here. The side that is opposite the right angle is called the hypotenuse. It's the longest side, and the side that's adjacent to it is the one that's going out here where this angle is. Now, because it's all about relative to this angle, for this angle, this is the side that's adjacent to it, and this is the side that's opposite of the angle here. So whichever angle you're interested in figuring out will tell you which side is opposite or adjacent. Okay. And so we can also remember the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that the sides of these triangles have to add up. This is a, this would be b, and the hypotenuse is always c. Okay, so just some reminders. SOHCAHTOA helps us remember that the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse, the cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse, and the tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. Okay. And so knowing that, we can convert between the angle that we're interested in, and if we're going to use the, in this case, we've got a, this is, remember, this is our stream going this way, and this is our rod, and then this is the right angle, and this is the distance above the stream, and we're interested in this angle here. We know the length of our rod, and we know this distance. We don't know the hypotenuse, and we don't care, frankly. We don't need to know it. So in this case, this is the angle. We know the adjacent and we know the opposite, but we don't know the hypotenuse. So in that case, we're going to use the tangent. Now, if we know the angle, we can use the tangent to figure out the opposite over the adjacent. In this case, we know the opposite and the adjacent, and we can use the ratio of them and the inverse tangent to figure out the angle. So how that works is, and you might pull out a calculator so you can follow along. If our rod is 210 centimeters long and our ruler says we're 6 centimeters above the surface of the water, then we would take the inverse tangent of 6, which is the opposite, divided by 210, which is the adjacent, and we would get 0.38 degrees. So make sure you try this on your own calculator so that you know how to do it. Most calculators will report the results in radians instead of degrees, so make sure you know how to turn it between those two. So do this problem until you get 0.38 on your calculator, and then you'll know how to do it when you measure this for yourself. So it is important to understand all of these features about your river, but also to understand that there's many scales at which you could ask a question in freshwater ecology. So you could use maps and say LIDAR and remote sensing to answer a question at the whole watershed level, or you could zoom in on a stream segment and you could ask a question at that level. So most of your questions are going to be at the stream segment level or smaller. Within a segment, you could look at a reach. And then within a reach, you might look at a specific pool riffle pair, okay? Or maybe you're going to go into a specific pool and you're going to look at some microhabitat, like who are the bugs living in detritus versus living in sand or something like that. So there's all these different scales that we might ask research questions. And as the scale of your observation changes, the forces that act at that scale also change. So climate or the source of flow or the geology and landform, those would exert control at the scale of the basin, right? Really big scales. But bank stability, woody debris inputs, and beaver, those could influence channel features and habitats at much smaller scales. So here's another just picture showing you some of the different terms that we use. We talk about riparian vegetation when it's growing along the shore of a stream. If you have flow going downstream, you might have detritus or debris of some kind trapped in a pool. You might have biofilms and periphyton, which is a type of algae growing on the surface of rocks. The hyporheic zone is a saturated zone underwater, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And then you have things like moss and algae growing on rocks as well. And so these things change as you're looking through a pool, riffle, and glide section. And then we can talk about the hierarchical organization from the smallest particle in a stream at the smallest spatial and temporal scale in the bottom left-hand corner, moving up to rocks and wood or pools and riffles, reaches, stream sections, and whole watersheds. And notice that there's a log scale on both X and Y that you could also, depending on what you're interested in studying, you might change your scale, right? So if you're asking a question about microbes, you're going to need to work at a pretty small scale. Whereas if you're asking a question about fish, you're going to need to kind of expand out your view. Okay? Or if you're working with alligators or hippopotamus, you're going to have to work at a really large scale. This is a quote from Luna Leopold: "Rivers are the gutters down which run the ruins of continents." And I think one of the most fascinating things about freshwater ecology is just the long history that humans have had with rivers, using them for transportation and waste transport and industrial effluent and sewers, all the way up to, having wild and scenic rivers and national parks and places where they're protected, having little parks and neighborhoods where kids get to play in ponds and streams. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some different flow terminology. The first one is velocity, the speed of water moving in any small region of stream channel. It's also called the current. And it's measured as a distance over time. So this is actually not too difficult to measure. It's how long does it take something to float down a specific distance. And so we say V equals M divided by S, so meters per second. You can also say M times S to the -1. Those are analogous. And again, the thalweg is the fastest flow, the deepest point in a stream. And so that's going to kind of shift as you move, as the stream channel changes shape. So this is showing a cross section where the thalweg is and where the fastest flow point might be. So depending on your tools, you might have a really fancy flow meter that can measure at any point in the water column. And if that's the case, you're going to try to make measurements as you move across the stream in cross section, kind of doing a transect. And you want to measure the velocity at not half depth, but a little bit deeper than half, so 0.6 depth. And that's because there's friction with the surface, there's friction with the bottom, and 60% of total depth is the best place to measure. If you don't have a fancy tool like that, we're going to use something that floats, but not perfectly. So something that's what's called neutrally buoyant, that sinks a little bit so that it gets captured in that flow. And so we're going to use a tangerine or a little orange or an apple or something like that. The other type of flow terminology is called discharge, and it's the rate of flow at a given moment in time expressed as a volume per unit time. So it's not just the speed, it's how much volume is moving through the system. And it's generally measured in either cubic feet per second or cubic meters per second. And so here's a cool stream mapper. You can go and look at lots of different streams all over Washington. So here's an image showing you discharge. It's velocity times area divided by time. Okay, so it's the rate of flow at a given moment expressed as a volume. So it's a volume divided by time, or in this case, cubic feet per second, or CFS, or cubic meters per second. And so it's the width times the depth times the velocity. And remember, the velocity is in meters per second. And is it all just erosion? No, in fact, deposition is equally important. Things like changes in climate and basin conditions and flow regulations can all cause aggradation, which is the upward movement of a stream bed due to sediment deposition. So rivers don't just scour out, sometimes they build up. And here you can see this bridge is almost becoming obsolete because the river is aggrading underneath it. Typically this happens at deltas, but it can occur anywhere sediment is dumped, especially during high flows. So often dams on rivers remove sediment. So here's some pictures of the Colorado River again, which is starved of its sediment. It should look like the rich red color at the top, but instead you see this beautiful crystal green water. And it's really transporting insufficient sediment because of upstream storage behind the dam. And this is a real big problem for native fish in the Colorado River. Since about 1900, almost 5,000 square kilometers of wetlands in coastal Louisiana has been lost at rates as high as 100 square kilometers per year. And this is a problem for the Delta in Mississippi. So it's called the bird's foot, and it shows you where old deltas used to be. And you can see these just really dramatic changes in the delta of the Mississippi River. Here you can see a really interesting picture from the Elwha Dam removal. This is a plume of sediment coming out after the dam was breached. So on the right-hand side, you can see where the dam used to be. All of that material behind the dam rushed down the stream and was deposited at the mouth of the Elwha River, and actually has created many, many acres of new territory for the lower Elwha Clallam tribe. So here you can see between 2011 and 2017, this dramatic pulse of sediment out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, creating this new delta at the mouth of the Elwha River. Okay, so there's lots of reasons for hope. It was really exciting to watch the two dams on the Elwha River come down, and really exciting to see how these rivers recover from dam removal. And you'll get to read some papers about the Elwha. Okay, take a little break and we'll come back.